For decades, the Sherman tank has carried an uncomfortable reputation. Many people imagine it as a flimsy metal box, too thin, too slow, and too weak to stand against the armored monsters of Nazi Germany. In books, in documentaries, and in the stories passed down by veterans, the Tiger and the Panther often steal the spotlight, towering like steel beasts of legend. And somewhere in their shadows, the Sherman is remembered as the tank that burned easily, the one that soldiers called Ronson because it lit up fast when hit. But history is rarely that simple. And when we return to the battlefields of 1944, a very different picture begins to emerge. It starts with the young American crews who climbed into their Shermans each morning with a mixture of fear and determination. Many were just 19 or 20 years old. They had seen the wrecks of Shermans along the hedgerows of Normandy, and they knew exactly what a German 88mm gun could do. Yet every day, they tightened their helmets, fired up the engines, and rolled forward. Not because they felt invincible, but because they trusted something most people never talk about: the Sherman's reliability, its maneuverability, and the teamwork that held each crew together. Meanwhile, German tank units across France were dealing with a very different reality. Their Tigers and Panthers were powerful, yes. They could punch through almost any tank the Allies had. But they were heavy, mechanically fragile, and desperately short on fuel. Some broke down before they even reached the battlefield. Others sat hidden for hours, waiting for gasoline that never arrived. The Sherman was the opposite. It moved quickly. It rarely broke down. And most importantly, there were enough of them, supported by mechanics, fuel trucks, spare parts, and a logistics system unmatched by any army in the world at that time. Still, the myth survived. Shermans were worthless. And then came the battle that shattered that belief. As American armored divisions pushed through France, a German counterattack gathered strength. Panthers and Tigers rolled forward under the morning fog, confident that the thin-skinned Shermans would stand no chance. They had crushed Allied armor before. They expected to do it again. But the battlefield had changed. Shermans used their speed to outmaneuver heavier tanks. They took hull-down positions on ridgelines, exposing only their turrets. They coordinated through radios, something many German tanks still lacked. And alongside them, Firefly Shermans with powerful British 17-pounder guns waited in ambush, ready to strike from long distances. What happened next would stun even the Germans. Across rolling fields, villages, and narrow farm roads, Sherman crews worked together like a single machine. They flanked German armor, cut supply lines, and struck weak points. And in the chaos that followed, the so-called worthless Shermans would go on to destroy an astonishing 281 German tanks, a number that no critic of the Sherman can ever ignore. The myth of the flimsy Sherman began to crumble, and in its place a truth was reborn, that a tank is more than armor thickness or gun size. It is the speed of decision-making. It is the reliability that keeps it moving. It is the men inside it. And it is the army behind it. This was the moment the world learned that the Sherman was never a failure. It was a weapon that turned strategy into victory, one battle at a time. Europe in 1944 was a continent on the edge of transformation. The Allied landings in Normandy had cracked open Hitler's fortress, but the breakthrough came at a heavy price. The hedgerows of France had turned into a maze of ambushes, where every field was a trap and every crossroads a battleground. Both sides knew that the next months would decide the fate of the war. American armored divisions, pushing inland from the beaches, faced the brutal reality of German defensive mastery. The Wehrmacht had spent years preparing France for battle. They dug in anti-tank guns, fortified villages and set up hidden positions that could shred an advancing force in minutes. Yet despite these obstacles, the Allies had something Germany lacked: momentum, supply, and overwhelming logistical strength. At the center of this struggle stood the Sherman tank. Tens of thousands had been shipped across the Atlantic, each one ready to roll the moment it touched French soil. They were not perfect. Their armor was thinner, and their guns were weaker than the feared German Panthers and Tigers. But in 1944, perfection mattered less than presence. And the Allies could put Shermans everywhere, on roads, in forests, on hills, and behind infantry lines, while the Germans struggled to keep their few heavy tanks fueled and functioning. By late summer, the battlefield was changing. Normandy's hedgerows opened into the wide, rolling fields of central France, terrain much better suited for tank warfare. For the first time, the Shermans could use their speed and agility the way they were meant to. They no longer had to squeeze through tight lanes or creep forward blind. They could maneuver, flank, and attack with freedom. But the Germans were far from defeated. High command rushed armored divisions from every corner of the collapsing Eastern Front and from deep within Germany itself. These reinforcements carried some of the most feared armor the world had ever seen: the Panthers with their long 75mm guns, and the Tigers, beasts of steel capable of destroying a Sherman with a single shot from over a mile away. Yet those advantages came with steep costs. Every mile a Panther traveled risked a breakdown. Every Tiger consumed fuel Germany no longer had. Tanks that looked invincible on paper became liabilities in a war Germany was no longer equipped to fight. American commanders understood this perfectly. Instead of relying on brute force, they built a war machine powered by coordination. Infantry, artillery, tank crews, engineers, air support, and supply convoys moved like a single organism. Radios crackled constantly with reports, warnings, and orders. When German tanks appeared, Shermans didn't fight alone. They fought as part of a combined arms system designed to overwhelm the enemy not with one blow, but with dozens. By September 1944, both armies were preparing for a clash unlike any before. Fog rolled across the French countryside. German tank units, confident that their armored superiority would break the American advance, gathered for a massive counterattack. Meanwhile, U.S. forces fortified ridgelines, positioned their Shermans, and coordinated air and artillery support. The stage was set. The world saw German armor as unbeatable, American tanks as inferior. But Europe in 1944 was not a battlefield of myths. It was a battlefield where reliability beat fragility, where supply beat scarcity, and where strategy beat steel. And as both sides prepared to collide, no one could imagine that the coming battles would shatter one of the most persistent myths in military history, leading to the destruction of 281 German tanks at the hands of the very Shermans so often labeled worthless. Dawn arrived quietly on the French countryside. A pale fog drifted across the open fields, settling in low pockets between the ridgelines. American crews inside their Shermans could barely see more than 100 meters ahead. Engines rumbled, radios buzzed with static, and commanders scanned the mist, knowing that somewhere out there, a German armored counterattack was forming like a storm. The silence broke at 7:15 a.m. A forward observer spotted dark shapes moving through the fog, too big to be trucks, too slow to be infantry. "Panthers," he whispered into the radio. "They're coming straight at us." Moments later, the ground shook as dozens of German tanks advanced, confident that the morning haze would hide their approach. But the Germans didn't realize the fog hid something else. Shermans positioned perfectly across the hills. American tankers had spent the night preparing for this moment. They dug in behind rises in the terrain, exposing only their turrets. They positioned Firefly Shermans with long-range British 17-pounder guns at the edges of the formation. And unlike many German crews, every Sherman was connected by radio, ready to react in seconds. The first shots came from a Firefly. A Panther emerged from the fog, unaware it had been sighted. A bright flash lit the ridge. The 17-pounder round tore through the Panther's front armor, sending it bursting into flame. German crews, stunned by the ambush, immediately returned fire, but most of their shells struck the hill, missing the Shermans entirely. Then the real fight began. Shermans surged forward, using their maneuverability to circle the fog banks, hitting the German tanks from angles they never expected. While the Panthers focused their guns on the ridgeline, American tanks slipped around the flanks. Every few seconds, the calm countryside echoed with the thunder of tank cannons. Inside one Sherman, a crew of 5 young men moved in perfect rhythm. The loader rammed shells into the breach as fast as he could. The gunner called out ranges, 600 fire, 800 fire. The driver pushed forward, backing off, turning sharply, never staying still long enough to become an easy target. Their training had become instinct, and all along the ridge, similar scenes unfolded. German tanks were powerful but blind in the fog. Their commanders struggled to spot Shermans darting between hedgerows. Their heavy armor slowed them down, while the Shermans seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts. In one sector, a group of Panthers attempted a breakthrough, aiming to crush the American right flank. But artillery observers saw their movement. Within minutes, U.S. guns opened up, hammering the German advance. Shermans moved in immediately after, finishing off the damaged tanks before they could retreat. The fog that the Germans hoped to use as cover instead became their trap. At the height of the battle, a Panther battalion attempted to charge forward in a desperate attack. Shermans waited silently until the Germans crossed an open field, then unleashed a coordinated volley that knocked out tank after tank. Fireflies targeted the lead vehicles while regular Shermans hit the sides of the formation from concealed angles. The attack collapsed almost instantly. By midday, the battlefield was scattered with burning armor. German commanders were shocked. They had expected to face disorganized, inferior tanks. Instead, they found themselves overwhelmed by coordination, mobility, and relentless counterattacks. Shermans that many believed would crumble had instead dictated the flow of the battle. They used terrain, teamwork, and communication to outfight tanks that were, on paper, far superior. The eruption of the battle revealed a truth Germany had not anticipated. The Shermans were not prey. They were hunters, fast, coordinated, and lethal. And this day was only the beginning of the destruction that would wipe out 281 German tanks. By midday, the battle had turned into a storm of steel and fire. Smoke drifted across the French fields, forming dark curtains that hid destroyed vehicles and isolated groups of German armor still pressing forward. What began as a confident German counterattack was now dissolving into chaos, but the fighting was far from over. The German commanders, realizing their initial wave had been stopped, threw in their reserves. More Panthers, more Tigers, and assault guns rumbled forward, determined to break the American line. Their orders were simple: push through at any cost. Many of these tank crews believed the Shermans were nearly defeated, that only one last push was needed. They were wrong. American units had not only held, they had reorganized and reinforced their positions with remarkable speed. Radios crackled across the battlefield as tank commanders shared coordinates, warned of enemy movements, and called for artillery. The Shermans, far more mobile than their German opponents, shifted from ridge to ridge like water flowing along the landscape. On the northern flank, a group of 15 Panthers attempted a breakthrough. They advanced in a tight formation, their heavy armor gleaming through the smoke. But American observers spotted them minutes before they reached firing range. Artillery batteries opened fire, dropping shells across the path of the Panthers. 2 tanks were disabled immediately, and just as the survivors tried to maneuver around the impacts, a platoon of Shermans struck from the side, firing rapidly, hitting the Panthers where their armor was weakest. Within 8 minutes, the German formation was gone. Further south, a Tiger company tried to push through a small village, expecting the streets to provide cover. Instead, they rolled straight into a trap. American engineers had rigged the road with obstacles, forcing the Tigers to slow down. From concealed positions behind stone barns, Firefly Shermans fired into the lead Tiger. The massive vehicle erupted in flames. The second Tiger attempted to reverse but was hit by 2 Sherman rounds to the turret ring. The rest of the German tanks abandoned the advance, some even withdrawing without firing a shot. But the moment that truly broke the offensive came in the early afternoon. A large contingent of German armor assembled for a final push, over 40 tanks moving together in a desperate attempt to smash the American center. They advanced across open terrain, believing the fog and smoke would hide them. But the Americans had already prepared the field. Shermans waited in staggered lines across the hills. Behind them, hidden artillery batteries were locked onto pre-plotted coordinates. And overhead, the fog began to lift just enough for American reconnaissance planes to mark the German advance. The order was given. Artillery rained down first. Then the Shermans surged forward, each one firing and relocating in a rhythm so fast the German tanks couldn't keep up. Firefly shells pierced Panthers from over a kilometer away. Regular Shermans targeted German flanks, setting off ammunition racks and sending black plumes into the sky. The German attack broke apart almost immediately as crews abandoned burning vehicles, and others struggled to maneuver through piles of wreckage. Within 2 hours, the field was littered with destroyed armor. Rows of Panthers and Tigers knocked out, many still smoldering. By the time the sun began to set, the outcome was undeniable. The German offensive had collapsed. Their armored spearhead was shattered. And across the battlefield, American tank commanders counted the results. 281 German tanks destroyed, many of them lost to breakdowns, fuel shortages, or desperate abandonment, but the majority knocked out by the very Shermans so many had underestimated. What was supposed to be a decisive German counterattack became one of the most devastating armored defeats in their history. The Shermans had proven not only resilient, but deadly, faster, more coordinated, and supported by a supply system the Germans could no longer match. In one day, a myth had been broken, and the battlefield told the truth. The worthless Shiva of steel had crushed the German offensive with precision, teamwork, and overwhelming resolve. When the smoke cleared and the engines fell silent, the battlefield told a story that history would argue over for decades. Burned-out Panthers and Tigers lay scattered across the countryside. Blackened turrets, shattered treads, and abandoned hulls marked the places where the German counteroffensive had collapsed. And among them, Sherman stood with chipped paint and scorched armor. Silent survivors of a battle many believed they should never have won. Yet this victory was no accident. It was the product of a machine designed not for perfection but for purpose. In the years after the war, people often judged tanks the way they judged monuments, by size, weight, and the thickness of their armor. On paper, the Sherman seemed inferior. Its gun was smaller. Its armor was thinner. The silhouette was taller. And veterans remembered how violently a Sherman could explode when hit by a German 88mm round. But these measurements alone could never tell the full story. The true legacy of the Sherman lived in the things paper could not measure. It lived in the engine that started in the freezing mornings when German tanks refused to turn over. It lived in the mechanics who could repair a Sherman overnight, while German crews spent days waiting for spare parts. It lived in the radios that allowed dozens of Sherman crews to move like a single organism, sharing every sighting, every threat, every opportunity. And it lived in the American soldiers who understood the Sherman not as a steel coffin, but as a tool, one piece of a vast war machine built on coordination, speed, and overwhelming supply. The German army had powerful tanks, but they were fighting with shrinking resources and dangerously overstretched supply lines. Their armor was strong, but their logistics were collapsing. Every Tiger that broke down was a loss they could not replace. Every Panther that ran out of fuel became a steel monument to a war Germany was already losing. The Sherman, however, was always ready for the next mile, the next hill, the next fight. The battle that destroyed 281 German tanks became more than a tactical victory. It became proof of a principle that would shape mechanized warfare for generations. Success on the battlefield was not about building the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It was about creating a weapon soldiers could rely on in every moment, and supporting it with fuel, ammunition, engineers, and communication systems that never stopped moving. This was the Sherman's gift to history. Long after the war ended, military scholars began to reassess the tank's reputation. They studied battle reports, interviewed veterans, and reviewed German documents. Again and again, the same truth appeared. The Sherman was not the best tank of the war, but it was the most effective. It was the tank that was always where it needed to be. The tank that fought in every major Allied operation. The tank that advanced relentlessly from Normandy to the Rhine and beyond. And in the battle where it crushed 281 German tanks, the Sherman proved that victory comes not from fearsome design alone, but from a combination of reliability, teamwork, mobility, and sheer determination. Today, when historians walk the fields where that battle was fought, they see more than old wrecks and rusted steel. They see a turning point. They see proof that myths can be broken. And they see the legacy of a machine that outperformed expectations and outlasted the giants that once overshadowed it. The Sherman was never worthless. It was the tank that carried its crews to victory, one ridge, one field, one impossible battle at a time. And its legacy, born in fire and fear, remains one of the great truths of the Second World War.